So I wanted to pull up an article that broke actually today, I believe it was August 20th. So as we're speaking on this August 20th, the Washington Post, and this is not necessarily out of the ordinary right now. The Western mainstream media, the New York Times, CNN had a pretty damning assessment of what's happening in this counteroffensive for Ukraine. But today, very, very late, actually, or I should say very early in the morning, the Washington Post came out with this story. Ukraine is running out of options to retake significant territory. And I don't know if you all can see this. I can zoom in a little bit more. They highlight it for you. So generous of the Washington Post to highlight that Ukraine appears to be running out of options in a counteroffensive that officials originally framed as Kiev's crucial operation to retake significant territory from Russian forces this year. More than 2 months into the fight, the counteroffensive shows signs of stalling, which you've talked a lot about, Brian. But Kiev's advances remain isolated to a handful of villages. Russian troops are pushing forward in the north, and a plan to train Ukrainian pilots on U.S.-made F-16s is delayed. So a new classified U.S. intelligence report has predicted that the counteroffensive will fail to reach the key southeastern city of Melitopol this year, stoking fears that the conflict is becoming a stalemate and international support could erode. So, Brian, talk to us about what's happening on the battlefield and why is it that Ukraine is having so much problem in this counteroffensive that we've been told all the way up until, I would say, just the last few weeks or so would be a huge success for Ukraine.
Well, what we're looking at right now is the Western media simply acknowledging the reality that a lot of other people, including yourself, myself, many other analysts have been talking about, again, for months, if not over a year. We've been talking about this. We've been explaining the problem of trying to create new armies out of thin air and build up new brigades out of thin air. We had all of these Western analysts saying, no, Ukraine has this big advantage over Russia. They have all of NATO helping them reconstitute brigades. They have all of this equipment coming in. They can train Ukrainian soldiers, bring them up to NATO standards, and this will be a game changer for Ukraine versus Russia, who has a poorly trained military, poorly led, poorly equipped. Everything about the Russian military is circling the drain, and everything is looking up for Ukraine. But if you looked into the details of even what the Western media was reporting, because that's all I do with my analysis, all I do is I read through Western media, reading what Western military analysts, politicians, military leaders say, and I simply draw the conclusions that they refuse to because of a political imperative that they have. They cannot acknowledge that all of this does not add up for victory for Ukraine. They're not allowed to acknowledge this, but I am able to do that. I looked through all the information that they presented, and that's the conclusions that I presented. That we're looking at a multitude of problems that have been accumulating over the months. We've talked many times about things like ammunition. The United States cannot find enough Soviet-era 152 millimeter ammunition to send Ukraine. No one in Europe makes enough of it to send to Ukraine to sustain their rates of fire. They can't even build, manufacture, produce enough of their own 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. They are planning to expand production, both the US and Europe, by 2027. They have this plan of making so many shells by 2027. But if you look at the actual numbers, it's still less than what Russia is producing right now. Again, according to Western sources, the amount of artillery Russia is producing, artillery rounds that they're producing each month, is going to be more. It is right now more than what the US and Europe plan to make by 2027. So this is a huge problem. That is an unsolvable problem. There's no way to solve this problem. Expanding production takes months, if not years, to do. Finding more people to work in your factories, physically expanding the factories, scaling this up takes time. It's not something you could do overnight. So this is one problem that the US and its allies have in sustaining this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. The other problem was training. the idea that you're going to take conscripts from Ukraine, give them a couple of weeks of training, and then send them into combat and have them succeed, this was a fantasy. This was never going to work. There was no way for this to work. I have explained how basic entry-level infantrymen in the U.S. Marine Corps will train for about 5 months between basic training and then their infantry-specific training. Then they go to their units, and then they train some more. And if you're familiar with U.S. military operations over the years, Desert Storm, the Iraq invasion in 2003, Afghanistan, different campaigns in different wars the U.S. has been involved in, they take their existing trained manpower and then they train for 6 months to a year for a specific campaign. So even that training is more extensive than what they gave to these Ukrainians that were supposed to pull off this. Again, it was a total fantasy to think that Ukraine could pull off this offensive. And then the third problem is the very nature of the fighting. This is not the U.S. invading a developing world nation with scarcely a military or no formal military at all. This is Ukraine going up against the armed forces of the Russian Federation. They are trying to take ground forces with extremely limited, almost non-existent air power and go up against Russian forces that have prepared for months, built these elaborate defenses, and then ahead of them, these extensive minefields, Russia's huge amount of long-range weapons, artillery, rockets, missiles, their extensive use of air power, also their air defenses that they have for whatever air power Ukraine is able to produce. When you add all of this up, there was no way, regardless of even if you did bring these troops up to NATO training, NATO standards, there was still no way for them to break through. They have no air power, they have no air support, and they have insufficient amounts of artillery for all of the reasons we just discussed about artillery shell production. So all of this together meant that from the beginning, before the first shot was fired of this offensive, there was no way for it to succeed. Before the offensive, for several months, actually, I said I expected Ukraine to actually break through at least a few of the layers of defenses. Russia has layered defenses. I even suggested the possibility they could retake Bakhmut, but they haven't even managed to do any of this. As I figured, the layered defenses are designed for Russia to fall back, to absorb the full force of any one particular assault if they put enough manpower and equipment into it. But they haven't even done that. We're in the third month now of this offensive, and now there's these clocks that are ticking that I've talked about. Also, very often the U.S. and Europe surged large amounts of ammunition, including artillery shells, into Ukraine specifically for this offensive, but that is finite. Maybe 2 or 3 months worth of artillery shells. They brought in these 155 millimeter cluster munitions to try to extend the time on the clock for Ukraine to pull off this offensive, but it's not going to be enough. The cluster munitions are not the equivalent of the high explosive rounds that Ukraine actually needs. So these are all compromises that are part of a plan that was already doomed to fail from the very beginning.
Yeah, well, and I want to get your comment then, because you definitely laid out the just in all categories of what Ukraine needs to fight this conflict and to succeed. Ukraine just doesn't have it. And I know in recent weeks, there's been all kinds of hand-wringing about F-16s and the U.S. saying, oh, third parties can start sending them, and then saying, well, they can't really be trained on them anytime soon. Who knows when it's going to happen? It could take over a year for them to be truly battle ready. Now, at the same time that there's been these major issues, and the big one to me is with all of these problems that you mentioned in terms of being able to fight, it's cost Ukraine. I mean, it's cost the Ukrainian armed forces direly. We're talking about over 40,000, 43, 45,000 Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian troops, whatever we want to call them, dead. And then, of course, all of this equipment is being destroyed at the same time. So, given that, we've also seen Ukraine desperately. I mean, it seems like every day now there's a attempted drone attack. There's attempted attacks on Moscow. I know Kursk was recently hit by a drone that I think flew into a train station, the ceiling of a train station. And I think it hurt a few people because of the shattered glass. And then, of course, in the Belgorod, the border regions, there's been constant attacks there as well. And that's just been ongoing throughout the conflict. But it seems to have escalated as this counteroffensive has stalled. I mean, is there any connection here? And could you just talk about maybe these attacks on Russian territory? What is their function? Why are they happening? It seems more and more as this counteroffensive just slogs on, I guess.
It's a good question. And I'm fairly certain that, yes, it is connected. Either this drone campaign was designed to coincide with the offensive, and it was supposed to, because again, I am certain that there are military and political leaders in the West who knew the offensive, just in terms of tactics and strategy, was doomed to fail. There was another component, a psychological and political component they hoped would panic Russia into breaking, withdrawing, the government collapsing in Moscow, possibly. They were hoping for some other factor to grant Ukraine some sort of victory, and it just never happened. That said, they are still carrying these drone attacks out. The purpose of doing this is to distract away from the failure of the offensive. Alexander Mikuris of the Duran went over an article in The Guardian, again, citing Western analysts who were talking about how this is just psychological. There is no strategic objective for these drone strikes. They're not going to have any impact at all on Russia's war-making capabilities. And people might argue with that. There was just one this week, a drone attack on an airfield, a Russian military airfield inside of Russia. Tupolev Tu-22M3 is one of these long-range bombers, was damaged or possibly destroyed. The problem is that Russia has a lot of these bombers. They still manufacture these bombers. So unless you're doing that every day or almost every single day, it is not going to have an impact on Russia's ability to carry out this military operation. So what are they achieving then? The idea is that they're boosting morale back at home in Ukraine, and they're creating anger, division, undermining political unity in Russia, but it's not having that impact. It never does. This is the reason why terrorist campaigns almost always fail, because what it's actually doing is unifying the people in Russia further. People who are on the fence or indifferent, they're being forced to pay attention to this conflict. And of course, as they do, they understand how important it is for them to work together and get past this. So in actuality, it's accelerating Ukraine's defeat. It is not working toward any sort of Ukrainian victory.
Yes, and the desperation of it, they mainly fail, is what every report I see. They mainly fail. They get intercepted. They end up flying, crashing somewhere. I mean, on the one hand, though, you do mention the psychological campaign. I could get the thinking here, because I was thinking about like Alex Christoforou, I know, was recently in Moscow, and I could think, well, that might be scary, walking around the streets. The drones may at any point crash somewhere, even if they're failing. It does create some kind of problems, but at the same time, the desperation is real. I wanted to pull up something that for you to comment on that's also recently reported. Now, we were talking about the Washington Post and how they are now sounding the alarm about the counteroffensive. Well, Politico came out with an interesting piece as well recently, which I find to be, because months ago, Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he did say, hey, maybe there needs to be, this conflict, I think his comments were, this conflict is going to end in a negotiated settlement, so might as well do it now. And now Politico is saying, Milley had a point, because more and more U.S. officials are starting to come around to this. So the question is, should we have listened to him? So this was back in November. He said that's a good time for peace talks because the winter season is tough and Ukraine was supposedly in a stronger military position. And of course, nobody listened to him, right? If the end state of Ukraine is a free, independent, sovereign country with its territory intact, that will take considerable level of effort yet to come. That's going to take a long time, but you can also achieve these objectives maybe through some kind of diplomatic means. So anyway, I wanted to just bring this up because U.S. officials are starting to say, if we acknowledge we're not going to do this forever, then what are we going to do? There's obviously desperation. We may have missed a window to push for earlier talks. This is what anonymous officials are now saying. They're saying maybe we should have listened to Mark Milley. What is your take on that? It does feel very desperate, and it feels very connected to this. Well, we thought the counteroffensive was going to work out, and it's not going to work out, despite the fact that the CIA and the Pentagon both said counteroffensive is probably not going to work. But what's your analysis here?
If we understand fully how this entire conflict came to be, when the United States decided to overthrow the elected government of Ukraine in 2014, from that point onward, it was the United States that, number one, stripped Ukraine of its sovereignty. It installed a client regime into power that answered to Washington at the expense of Ukraine, everyone in Ukraine, no matter who they were, where they sat on the political spectrum. This was at their expense for Washington's pursuit of its geopolitical objectives. When we look at what was going on from 2014 onward, and the way this has escalated, at every single point, Russia has said, look, if you just do the Minsk agreements, all of Ukraine will be intact, of course, except for Crimea. That was the price that the US and their proxies paid for overthrowing the elected government in Ukraine, stripping Ukraine of its sovereignty. If you honor the Minsk agreements, all the rest of Ukraine will be intact. The Donbas region will have some autonomy. The Russian language will be protected and preserved. People will be left alone if they don't want to go along with this Ukrainian nationalism that the U.S. encouraged and allowed to take root. But they decided no, they're going to keep pushing, keep escalating. And so as they did, Russia escalated in kind. And now we have the special military operation. We see these oblasts now officially part of Russia. They are never going to give those back to Ukraine. And anyone who thinks that they are is, again, living in an absolute fantasy world. And there is the possibility that additional oblasts may be absorbed by the Russian Federation. So every single day that goes by, Ukraine is in a weaker position, and they will have less of their nation, their people to work with when they finally do go to the negotiation table. The United States doesn't care, though, because, again, this is a proxy war. You fight a proxy war, so somebody else pays the price for your war. And so as long as this is being paid by Ukrainian blood, Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian economy, what motivation does the U.S. have to go to the negotiation table? Because ultimately, this is about Russia and the U.S. negotiating, not Russia and Ukraine. And Kiev obviously has no say in any matter regarding this conflict. They haven't since 2014. So the U.S. has no motivation to negotiate. Even now, they still have no real motivation. We see this. It is common sense. Hey, we should start negotiating now. The offensive is a total failure. And every day that goes by, it's going to get worse and worse. There is no plan B after this offensive. We have exhausted our military means to wage this proxy war, but they're still going to hesitate because they can still, in their mind, kick the can down the road, just like they did in Afghanistan. How obvious was it that Afghanistan was not going to work out the way that the U.S. wanted? But how long did the U.S. try anyway? So 20 years.
Yes.
Exactly. And so unfortunately, this is the same situation Ukraine is in. It's the same situation occupied parts of Syria face right now. And this is only going to end when Russia and its allies, the rest of the world, they will create the conditions on the ground and around the globe that make it physically impossible for the US to use Ukraine in this manner any further. And that is what is going to eventually introduce peace, stability, and some sort of restoration and reconstruction of everything that's been destroyed in this process.
And lastly, on this topic of the counteroffensive, we've also seen NATO float to Ukraine. Now, this is a very interesting spat, I think, that has now come to a head. And I think now Ukraine has rejected it wholesale. But NATO suggested, and to me, this was always a losing battle, but NATO suggested that possibly membership to Ukraine could be fast-tracked in exchange for acknowledging that it would have to give up these territories, these oblasts that you referenced earlier, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, that's Russian territory now. Crimea, of course. I mean, long ago. But NATO is just saying, okay, acknowledge these territorial concessions, Ukraine. You can be a NATO member, right? And perhaps that would curtail the worst excesses of this conflict, possibly get that pause that I think actually the United States and NATO, as an instrument of the U.S., is actually seriously considering. But Ukraine's parliament immediately rejected it, came out with this document. It was a rabidly, you talk about nationalists, this like far right fascistic nationalists. Not only did they reject it, but they said, no, we are going to take back the territories. Then we're going to deport all the Russians out of these territories, which is exactly the problem that Russia has responded to in the special military operation, which is the treatment of Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, and of course, anyone deemed Russian, which could literally mean just anyone who opposes the special military operation. So to close on this Ukraine piece, your assessment of this?
Well, it's very interesting when you really think about it. If you look at Ukraine and Ukrainians, they are a part of Russia. They have been historically. These ultra nationalists have created a fiction. They believe in a fiction that does not exist in reality, or they're trying to make it manifest itself in reality, again, out of whole cloth. And this is what the US does all around the world. They cultivate these type of proxies who do not exist in reality. And they have these extremely irrational foundations that they're trying to build on, and everything that they build on top of this irrational, shaky foundation is likewise compromised. So the US has an unsustainable foreign policy. It uses unsustainable proxy forces to try to achieve these objectives. And I think that's what we're seeing unfold in Ukraine. It's a two-pronged problem where it's something the US actually cannot achieve, and they have a group of people that they're using as proxies that are incapable of achieving it, even if it was these. Just think of the type of people that would enlist with the United States against their own actual best interests. What type of people would do that? And are these people capable of achieving all of these things that they desire? Taking back all of the territory of 1991 borders, I think they say. Is that actually a realistic objective? And if people are pursuing an unrealistic objective, what should we conclude about their leadership qualities or even their ability to do basic reasoning? So this is a problem the US has always had. Their proxies have always been very questionable, incapable, incompetent people that need their hands held. That's why the US picks them. Nobody else would fulfill this role. And so it's a self-feeding loop. And it always, I would say, mostly results in very predictable failure. And unfortunately, we're watching that failure unfold in Ukraine. And it's not just these people, these proxies that are going to suffer. It's everyone else, absolutely everyone else in Ukraine, and even everyone anyone near Ukraine.
Yes, this conflict is surely, I mean, it's surely going to continue, and the consequences are just going to continue to mount, especially and in particular for Ukraine. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.